Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Karen Beckman, and I'm the Interim Director of the Penn Humanities Forum. Tonight, it is my great privilege to welcome you all to tonight's Dr. S.T. Lee Distinguished Lecture in the Humanities by Professor Michelle Alexander, who I will introduce to you shortly. This is the first event in the Forum's full year of public programs on the topic of violence, and really, what an awesome way to start. Here at Penn, we're committed to increasing access to higher education in as many ways as we can, and that includes our no-loan financial aid policy. So if you are a high school student sitting in the audience today and have bothered to show up tonight, I urge you to consider applying to Penn, in part for selfish reasons, because I want to teach students like you. Here at the Forum, we believe that access to lifelong learning opportunities is both a human need and a human right. And we seek to open educational spaces that foster exchange between Penn and the wider Philadelphia community so that we can learn from each other. At this moment, when our city's public schools are being decimated, this exchange between the city and the universities has never been more urgent. The massive turnout for tonight's event makes clear that in Philadelphia, we are a city where we care about each other's well-being, and we want to know what we can do to bring about structural change for the better. Our speaker tonight has brought together a thrilling array of folks from around the city, and you are all heartily welcome here to this and to all our future events. Speaking of which, please note that Jacqueline Campbell's October 30th talk on gender-based violence has been postponed until April 9th, so that is not as it is in your programs. And while I'm making announcements, please also remember to turn off your cell phones as well as your camera flashes. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to celebrate some of the groups who've come here tonight. Welcome to the groups from Bowie State, Ursinus, Arcadia, Pierce, Rowan, LaSalle, Goddard, Temple, the Delaware Humanities Forum, and all the other many college groups that are here, including Penn's own faculty, staff, and students from 6 different schools. Welcome also to the groups from Women Count, the Eastern State Penitentiary, the Philadelphia Prison Society, Uhuru Solidarity Movement, Teach for America, Decarcerate PA, the Philadelphia City Government, Penn's Upward Bound Program, the Public Interest Law Center, the Public Defender's Office, and the fabulous ACLU. Our speaker's work has highlighted the violence of stigmatization, and I want those of you here who have been incarcerated, along with your families, to know that we at the Forum welcome you here tonight and every day after this one. Tonight's event has been made possible by a number of people that I need to thank. At Penn, thanks go to the School of Arts and Sciences, the Office of the Provost, Penn Law, the Center for Africana Studies, the Department of Sociology, the Netta Center for Community Partnerships, and my amazing colleagues at the Forum, Professor Jim English, Jennifer Conway, Sarah Varney, Kate Aid, and all the students who volunteered to help tonight's event. As humanists, we are interested in what it means to be human. Our forms of communication, our creative and destructive urges, our varying modes of relationship, including those with non-human life, our striking ability to act in ways not motivated by self-interest, our spiritual, mental, and physical dimensions, our uneven ability to learn from history, and our species' truly remarkable capacity for making mistakes. Michelle Alexander is a highly acclaimed civil rights lawyer, advocate, and legal scholar who holds joint appointments at the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity and the Moritz College of Law at The Ohio State University. Before this, she was an associate professor of law at Stanford Law School, where she directed the civil rights clinics. For several years, she directed the Racial Justice Project for Northern California's ACLU, helping to lead a national campaign against racial profiling by law enforcement. While an associate at Saperstein, Goldstein, Demchak, and Boller, we're moving backwards in time here, she specialized in plaintiff side class active action lawsuits alleging race and gender discriminations. And before that, after graduating from Stanford Law School, she clerked for Justice Harry A. Blackmun on the United States Supreme Court and for Chief Judge Abner Mikva on the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. Her first book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness from 2010, was supported by a 2005 Soros Justice Fellowship. Although it's certainly no shabby thing that the book has stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for more than a year, Even more impressive is the way that this book has enriched the soil in which the seeds of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision were planted, enabling energetic conversation about mass incarceration as a new system of racial and social control to take root across this nation. Very recently, in The Nation, Alexander has committed to pursuing Dr. King's vision farther in order, and I quote, to connect the dots between poverty, racism, militarism, and materialism, end quote. Her book's extraordinary traction across quite different communities derives only in part from its rigorous research, its daring invocation of historical analogy, and its lucid writing. For Alexander has used her own powerful voice and personal presence as a portal into these many varied communities. Since the book's publication, she has tirelessly fostered care and awareness of this and other issues through her public talks. And so I salute her not only as an exemplary scholar, citizen, truly amazing working mom and leader, and I welcome her to Penn. Please join me in welcoming her here.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that incredibly generous and warm introduction. I am thrilled to be here, thrilled to be invited to participate in this phenomenal gathering devoted to a deep and critical exploration of the meaning and significance of violence in our communities and in our culture as practiced by individuals and by governments and experienced privately as well as collectively. When we talk about violence or violent crime, we usually think we know exactly what we mean. Certain ideas and images leap immediately to mind. These images and ideas aren't natural or inevitable, but are socially constructed and reinforced in countless ways every day, every month, every year, often unconsciously, sometimes consciously. But if we don't pause to reflect critically on the nature and structure of our thoughts and ideas about violence, we wind up behaving much like animals, mice or rats in a Psychology 101 experiment, responding reflexively to stimuli, a fight or flight response, without pausing to consider the meaning or significance of our experience and whether our conditioned behavior is morally good and of genuine value to ourselves or anyone else. So the type of conversation that this series of lectures is designed to facilitate is absolutely essential as we find ourselves surrounded and implicated by forms of violence that are both recognized and denied, forms of violence that are considered perfectly acceptable, and forms of violence that provoke outrage, terror, and scorn. The dividing line between normal and acceptable violence and the violence we condemn often seems natural and rational, normal, but when we pause long enough, we're often forced to confront that something ugly and insidious leads us to embrace some forms of violence and condemn the others. Several weeks ago, I received a letter from a man who has been held in prison for more than 10 years. I receive hundreds of letters from inmates and their families every year as a result of my work critiquing and challenging our criminal justice system. And I can't read or respond to all of the letters that I receive, but this letter I read and could not put down. It was a letter from a man who has been held in solitary confinement for years, a recognized form of torture in many other countries, but not here in America. He was writing because more than 20 years had been added to his short sentence. He had been placed in indefinite solitary confinement following a dispute with prison guards, and his isolation wore on for years. His mental condition deteriorated to a point that he had begun to lose his mind. On several occasions, he threw urine and feces at prison guards, and in one horrifying moment of desperation, he severed his own testicle and hung it on the door. These acts of desperation and insanity were deemed crimes of violence directed toward the prison guards, acts that justified decades of additional time added on to his sentence, decades of additional time to be locked alone in a cage. The acts were not interpreted as signs of severe mental illness, mental degeneration, or desperation after being confined for 23 hours a day in a windowless, barren cell with no human contact. No, his conduct was interpreted simply as an act of violence, the throwing of urine or feces, an act of aggression or hostility directed towards legitimate public authority. He, the man, the prisoner, was defined as violent, but his indefinite solitary confinement in that windowless, barren cell for years without clear end, that was not violence. The prison guards represented order. He, as helpless as he was deemed the embodiment of violence. For many years now, I've been dedicated to exposing and challenging the system of mass incarceration in the United States. It is a system of legally sanctioned violence. It is a system that uses force and violence to control millions of people, overwhelmingly poor people of color in the United States. It is a system that targets young people, often at early ages before they're old enough to vote, targets them, stops them, frisks them, searches them, throws them to the ground, often in search for drugs, and then shuttles them from decrepit, underfunded schools, segregated communities, to brand new high-tech prisons. It's a system that locks millions of people into a permanent second-class status, stripping them of the very civil and human rights supposedly won in the civil rights movement. It is a system that has decimated communities, destroyed families, and literally turned back the clock on racial progress in the United States. It's a system of racial and social control enforced with violence. Now, I'm always eager to admit that I was once the type of person who rejected this kind of talk out of hand. I rejected comparisons between mass incarceration and slavery and mass incarceration and Jim Crow, believing those kinds of claims or those kinds of comparisons were exaggerations, were distortions, even hyperbole. In fact, there was a time when I thought that people who made those kinds of claims and those kinds of comparisons were actually doing more harm than good to efforts to reform our criminal justice system and achieve greater racial equality in the United States. In fact, the first time I encountered the idea that our criminal justice system might be functioning much like a caste system, I was rushing to catch the bus in Oakland, California, and a bright orange poster stapled to a telephone pole caught my eye. And on it, it said in large, bold print, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." And I scanned the flyer, and I saw that some radical community group was holding a meeting several blocks away in a church, and they were going to be organizing in protest of the new 3 strikes law in California, the expansion of the prison system, racial profiling, the drug war, police brutality. And I scanned the flyer, and I thought to myself, yeah, our criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons to Jim Crow. People just think you're crazy. And then I crossed the street, hopped on the bus, headed to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project for the ACLU. Well, when I joined the ACLU, I assumed that our criminal justice system had problems of racial bias, much in the same way that all institutions in our society are infected to some degree or another with problems of conscious or unconscious bias and stereotyping and discrimination. So I thought it was my job as a civil rights lawyer and advocate to join together with other advocates and try to root out bias wherever and whenever it might rear its ugly head in our criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, I had come to realize that I was just dead wrong about our criminal justice system. It's not just another institution in our society infected with racial bias, but it has become a different beast entirely. The activists who posted that sign on the telephone pole weren't crazy, nor were the smattering of lawyers and advocates around the country that had begun to connect the dots between mass incarceration and earlier forms of racial and social control. Quite belatedly, I came to see that our criminal justice system now functions much more like a system of racial and social control than a system of crime prevention and control. As I describe in the introduction to my book, what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways in which it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, exclusion from jury service, are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it.